Aspect ratios have been hotly debated recently. Thank you, Christopher Nolan. And I've had to do a lot of educating for non film people about what an aspect ratio is. But it made me think about, what is the big deal? Why is it a big deal? And what should filmmakers consider when choosing their aspect ratios? So, on its most basic level, the aspect ratio is the size and shape of the image. Now, there are two ways of relating to it. I often talk about it as the size and shape of your canvas that you are creating onto. But there are two aspect ratios that you have to consider. The first is the aspect ratio of your format. So, a full frame sensor camera is going to have a different aspect ratio than a 3/4, and your resolutions are actually going to have a different size and shape for the images. Oftentimes they're kind of proportional to each other, but not always. And so, the format that you are creating on has its own size and shape. But then you have to think about what is the size and shape for your audience? How are they going to receive and consume and commune with this story that you have created? And that's obviously where the Odyssey threw everyone into a tizzy about where and how they were going to find an IMAX 70 millimeter or this or that or the other. Um, and so, at the beginning when we had film, we had different film stock sizes, 8 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, IMAX 70 millimeter. And those are all pretty proportional to one another, but again, the size and shape can be different. So, for example, 16 millimeter has, two perforations and has a little bit more of a square shape. So, like we've got the Academy ratio from film, which is more of like a 1.33, a 4:3, which is what the old tube television aspect ratio was. But then they, to differentiate from television, uh, the film industry started creating these kind of widescreen event type films, and that spawned something different where you ended up with a 185 widescreen. Or if you put on these special lenses, these anamorphic lenses, you could get a 235. They even ran the film sideways. There was CinemaScope. If anybody saw La La Land, So there were all of these kind of gimmicks that the industry tried to make films different from television, and widescreen was a part of that. And widescreen then had kind of two standards, which was 185, which was kind of slightly, that's with like the skinny black bars on top and bottom, and then the 235 with the anamorphic lenses. Nowadays it's more like 239. And what you got with that was literally the screen size when you saw it in the theater would be bigger, right? So, when you went to see something in 235, it was a much longer screen size than when you went to see it, a traditional widescreen. And that was kind of by design. And those movies at the time, that you could only see them in the theater, and there was no home video. You couldn't go home. You couldn't, you saw it in the theater, and that was it. And so you could really see and feel the impact of those epics, especially because most movies shot in the 235 anamorphic lenses were epics, and they had that kind of impact. Same with IMAX. What makes IMAX amazing is just that kind of overwhelming visual experience where you are transported into this other world. And It still is one of the best things about going to movies in a movie theater is to feel like you're being transported and you're just a speck of dust and you're witnessing this amazing stuff. Now, the irony moving into the home video ages is that when you would then go and rent the movies from home, those widescreen movies would get what was called the pan and scan treatment, where you would have this little blurb at the beginning of the movie that said, this movie has been formatted to fit your television size, essentially. And what they would do is they would take this kind of widescreen and they would either pan, like kind of zoom in, and if there were two people, they would kind of pan between the two people talking, even though that was not the originally designed shot. And it wasn't the DP making these choices or changing this edit, or they would just chop the movie in the center to fit the 4:3 tube television into what was called full screen. And you might get half of a person and another half of a person talking to each other because of this kind of awkward edit. And then digital TV came around and we ended up with 16:9, which is neither 1.85 nor 235. And you wonder, how did they come up with this? And it's actually a ratio in between the two, so it kind of best approximate both of them without compromising the integrity of the image. Because if you didn't want the pan and scan or the chopped full screen treatment, you would have to watch it on your tube television in this, really skinny box. But the problem still happens on 16:9 is that for 235, what's supposed to be this epic, cinematic, larger than widescreen experience ends up literally being smaller on your screen. Even if you have a big screen television, it is literally smaller than the screen itself because the aspect ratio, the size and shape of that image, is not the same as the size and shape of the screen. So, why does this matter? This matters because we want to tell engrossing stories. And when you're squinting to see the image, or when you cannot fully see the image, or when the image has been manipulated or chopped up in a certain way, you can even subconsciously disengage or be disconnected from those images. And I've seen a lot of debates. I've seen DPs say that anything that's not 235 is ugly. I've seen people say that 16:9 is ugly, but they love 185. I'm like, you're talking about an inch here and there. Like, if you're making an ugly image on 16:9, that is not the aspect ratio. But this is one of those things, like many others, that is hotly debated. But the problem still remains. How do you best engage with your audiences? And what is the best format for the story that you're telling? What is the best format for your audience to receive that storytelling? And that is where I think we're seeing a bit of a disconnect with the Christopher Nolans, who are insisting on, go to the theater. This is where, this is how it was supposed to be experienced. And then they're releasing it, though, in a multitude of different varieties. So did the people who went to just IMAX get a less experience than the IMAX 70mm? I ended up trying to do my best, wanted to see a film print, saw a 70mm film print, and then realized, oh, nope, that was also cropped. and so, and then people are seeing it in regular digital cinemas. So are we seeing a different movie? Are we having a different experience? Does it actually matter? What is important here? And there's obviously the artistic intent and the artist's idea, but then there's a matter of like control. If if this is the only way it's supposed to be seen, then you should only be releasing it in IMAX 70 millimeter. But that's not what they did. So then it's kind of like, okay, now you have to like let go a little bit and figure out what is the most important aspect of it. Now, we also have, with the advent of social media, new aspect ratios that have come on the scene. Uh, Instagram went to square, so that's something we've had to deal with. And then with the iPhones and the phones in general, people are recording vertically. And so that's an aspect ratio in the format that they are then also consuming in when they are scrolling and looking at reels vertically. People don't like to turn their phone and watch something horizontally in its intended aspect ratio. They want to watch it vertically. So what happens when you have a natively shot horizontal 185 film, or even a 16:9 film, when somebody's watching it vertically, and if you try and edit it into vertical, what you end up happening is the pan and scan all over again, where you're kind of starting over here and then digitally panning over to the person they're talking to, or you're cropping it in a way where you're just getting half a person's face and not much of the scene. My son ended up watching Blade Runner on his phone. Now, he didn't watch it vertically, but again, just the thought of watching that movie on this aspect ratio is was horrifying to me at the time. But at the same time, I am happier that he watched Blade Runner than not watching it. And it just reminds me of like the bootleg VHS tapes, or watching something on broadcast network that was both cropped for the tube TV and censored, by the networks. So, and had commercial breaks chopped up into it. Is it is it better that somebody is actually watching your project than not, or not in its purest form? I feel like being more inviting and creating curiosity is is the goal as a filmmaker. And to a certain extent, raising this question of aspect ratios obviously got a lot of people talking. But it's to me, it's a semantic debate. It's like we're splitting hairs over things. And at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, is it a good movie? Did we enjoy it? Is it worth the price of admission? And I did enjoy the Odyssey, even though I didn't see it in the proper format. So, but as filmmakers, as you're making these choices and figuring things out, it is important to figure out where your audience is going to watch your film. If you are making a movie for Instagram or TikTok, don't shoot it horizontally, shoot it vertically, which is obviously spawning all these vertical productions. Similarly, think about your shot sizes. Some of these epic 235 or IMAX, extreme wide shots, Lawrence of Arabia looking at the desert, when it's on this phone, does it have the same impact? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. And a lot of this is also kind of media literacy and our audience's engagement with stuff. The fact that we're watching things on our phone creates a bit more intimacy than when you're watching it on a big screen. So I don't know. I don't necessarily have answers to it, but I find it fascinating. And as a filmmaker myself, I do want to think about kind of what's the best way to tell this story and the best tools to both shoot it on, and then how am I going to best present it. But then there's so many different formats, and with promoting it on social media, you have to think about, okay, well, now there are these other shapes and sizes and things you have to think about. And that's something that I think is worth contemplating. We certainly had to do it in the old days, where our monitors had, all the guides, like here's TV safe, here's, 185, here's 235. and all of that stuff. And so you had to kind of like make sure that you were in control of the fact that, like, sure, we're shooting at 235, but we're making sure that our people are within TV safe, you know? So a little rant just to think about, what is the size and shape of the image that you're trying to create? How do you best think your audience is going to engage with it? And plan for that. you know, make sure it makes sense. Otherwise, you're you you might not be accomplishing what you think you are.